Hey there, buttercups! Can you imagine the Eiffel Tower being torn down and then sold for scrap? Well, believe it or not, the Eiffel Tower was almost sold for scrap once for real, then twice by a con artist. In this video, we will cover both stories. Okay, so picture this. We are all hanging out, maybe grabbing some coffee, and I ask you to name the first thing that pops into your head when you think of Paris. I bet like 99% of you would say the Eiffel Tower, right? It is on postcards. It is in every movie set in France, and it is basically the global symbol for romance and adventure. It is this massive, sparkly iron icon that seems like it has been there forever, like it grew out of the ground along with the city itself. But what if I told you that the whole thing was almost torn down and sold for scrap metal? Seriously, it is one of those wild history stories that sounds completely made up, but it is totally true. The city of Paris was just a few pen strokes away from dismantling its most famous landmark. This isn't just some little historical footnote. It was a huge, dramatic debate that had the whole city buzzing. So let's rewind the clock a bit. The year is 1889, and Paris is getting ready to throw the party of the century, the Exposition Universelle, or the World's Fair. These fairs were a massive deal back then, kind of like the Olympics and a giant tech conference all rolled into one. Countries would come to show off their latest inventions and cultural treasures, so they held a competition for a design, and a brilliant engineer named Gustave Eiffel came forward with his mind-blowing proposal for a gigantic iron lattice tower. The crazy thing is, from the very beginning, the tower was never meant to be a permanent part of the Paris skyline. The official contract that Gustave Eiffel signed was for a permit that lasted only 20 years. Think about that for a second. He and his team spent over 2 years assembling 18,038 pieces of wrought iron, held together by 2.5 million rivets, all for something that was scheduled to be torn down in 1909. You would think that building the tallest structure in the world would get you a round of applause. But in Paris, it got Gustave Eiffel a whole lot of hate mail. Seriously, the public opinion against the tower was fierce, especially from the city's artistic and literary elite. They were absolutely horrified by the idea of this monstrous metal skeleton looming over their beautiful, romantic city. They did not see innovation. They saw an industrial smokestack that had no place among the elegant architecture of Paris. Before the tower was even finished, a group of about 300 prominent artists, writers, and composers formed a group called the Committee of 300 to protest its construction. These were not just random angry citizens. We are talking about big names, like the writer Guy de Maupassant and the composer Charles Gounod. They co-signed a petition that was published in a major newspaper, and they did not hold back. They called the tower a truly tragic street lamp, a gigantic black smokestack, and a barbarous mass that would crush all the other beautiful monuments like a dark and hideous blot of ink. The story goes that the writer Guy de Maupassant hated the tower so much that he often ate lunch at the restaurant on its first level. When someone asked him why he would choose to eat inside the very thing he despised, he supposedly replied that it was the only place in all of Paris where he couldn't see it. That is some next-level commitment to your dislike right there. Just when it seemed like the tower was destined for the scrapyard, its creator stepped into the ring to fight for its life. Gustave Eiffel was not just an engineer who built a thing and moved on. He was deeply, personally invested in his creation. He had poured his heart, his reputation, and a significant amount of his own money into this project. He truly believed it was more than just a temporary fairground attraction. He saw it as a symbol of French ingenuity and modern engineering, a monument that represented the future, not just the past. So when the calls for its demolition grew louder, Eiffel refused to stand by and watch his masterpiece be torn apart. Eiffel was a brilliant man, not just as an engineer but as a strategist. He knew he could not win the fight on aesthetic grounds. The artists had already made up their minds, and you cannot really argue with someone about what they find beautiful or ugly. So, instead of fighting about art, he decided to change the conversation entirely. He needed to prove that the tower had a value that went far beyond its appearance. He needed to make it so indispensable to Paris that tearing it down would be not just a shame, but a stupid, impractical decision. Gustave Eiffel's big idea was simple but brilliant. Turn the tower into a giant open-air science lab. He argued that its incredible height, which made it the tallest man-made structure in the world at the time. Standing 330 meters, or 1,083 feet tall, the Eiffel Tower was the first man-made structure that was taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza, by more than twice its height. Gustave offered a unique platform for all sorts of scientific research that was impossible to conduct anywhere else. He was not just making vague suggestions, he came up with a concrete plan. He proposed that the tower could be used as a premier meteorological station. Scientists could install barometers, anemometers, and thermometers at various levels to study wind speed, air pressure, and temperature changes at different altitudes. He reached out to the scientific community and invited them to use his tower for their experiments. He personally financed the installation of a small laboratory on the third level, complete with all the necessary equipment. He encouraged astronomers to use the tower's stable, high-altitude platform to make observations of the cosmos, far above the dust and haze of the city streets. He even installed a Foucault pendulum, a massive swinging weight, to provide a dramatic and public demonstration of the Earth's rotation. He was actively turning the tower into a hub of scientific discovery and public education. He showed how the information on wind resistance gathered from the tower could be vital for the brand new field of aviation. Early aviators and airplane designers, like the Wright brothers, actually used data from Eiffel's experiments to help them understand aerodynamics. Suddenly, the tower was not just a pretty or ugly structure, it was contributing to the cutting edge of modern technology. Just as the scientific experiments were starting to prove the tower's worth, a brand new technology emerged that would seal its fate for good: the radio. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, scientists were just beginning to figure out how to send messages through the air using electromagnetic waves. It was a revolutionary concept, but they had a major problem. To send a signal over a long distance, you needed a very, very tall antenna. And as it happened, Paris had a 300-meter-tall, ready-made iron antenna just sitting there, waiting for a job. It was a match made in technological heaven. Gustave Eiffel, always quick to spot an opportunity, immediately saw the potential. He enthusiastically offered his tower as a platform for radio experiments. In 1898, the first successful radio transmission in France was sent from the top of the Eiffel Tower to the Pantheon, a distance of about 4 kilometers. It was a huge breakthrough. The French military, in particular, perked up its ears. They instantly recognized the strategic importance of long-distance wireless communication. Being able to send coded messages to troops in the field or to ships at sea, without relying on vulnerable telegraph cables, was a massive military advantage. The tower quickly became the heart of France's burgeoning radio telegraphy network. In 1903, just 6 years before the demolition deadline, Eiffel convinced the military to install a permanent radio antenna on the tower. This was the masterstroke. The tower was no longer just a lab for civilian science, it was now a critical asset for national defense. So in the end, it was not the beauty of the tower or the millions of tourists that saved it from being turned into a pile of scrap. It was its voice. By becoming the most important radio antenna in France, the tower literally learned how to talk, sending messages across the country and over the seas. This new ability made it absolutely indispensable. The very thing that the artist had called a barbarous mass became a sophisticated instrument of communication, connecting Paris to the rest of the world in a way no one had ever imagined. It was the ultimate plot twist in the tower's dramatic story. The city of Paris officially renewed the tower's permit in 1909, and from that point on, its place in the city was secure. But something else amazing happened along the way. As the years went by, public perception began to change. People got used to seeing the tower on their skyline. A new generation grew up with it, and they did not see a monstrous smokestack. They saw a familiar and comforting landmark. It slowly worked its way into the heart of Parisian culture. The tower that was once hated became loved. It is kind of funny how things work out. The tower's practical uses saved it long enough for people to finally appreciate its artistic merit. The same radical, modern design that had horrified the traditionalists in 1889 eventually came to be seen as elegant, daring, and beautiful. It became a muse for new artists like Robert Delaunay and Marc Chagall, who celebrated its geometric grace in their paintings. So the next time you see a picture of the Eiffel Tower, all lit up and sparkling at night, remember the story of its narrow escape. It is not just a tall, pretty thing to look at. It is a survivor. It is a testament to one man's stubborn belief in his creation and the unexpected power of science to change our minds. It is a tower that had to fight for its life by becoming a laboratory and a radio host, and in doing so, it transformed from a temporary spectacle into an eternal symbol of Paris. It had to prove it was useful before we could all agree it was beautiful.
Okay, buttercups, let's talk about Paris. You know, city of love, amazing croissants, and that big pointy thing called the Eiffel Tower. It is probably the most famous landmark in the world. People take millions of photos with it. They climb it, they propose under it, they put little tiny versions of it on their keychains. But what if I told you that someone once tried to sell it? Not as a landmark, oh no. He tried to sell it for scrap metal like an old rusty car. And the best part, he did it twice. This story is completely bonkers. So grab a cup of tea, maybe a biscuit, and let's dive into the most brilliant, most ridiculous con in history. Honestly, you won't believe it. This all happened back in 1925. Let's get properly introduced to our main character, Victor Lustig. He wasn't French, not at all. He came from the area we now call the Czech Republic. But he could speak about 5 languages fluently, including French, and he could slip into any high society party like he was born there. He was always dressed impeccably. We are talking tailored suits, polished shoes, and a hat tilted at just the right angle. He had these calm, intelligent eyes that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. He was a master of reading people, of finding their secret wishes and their biggest fears, and then using those against them. He was, in short, a professional trickster. Before he set his sights on the Eiffel Tower, Victor had a long and very successful career in con artistry. He spent years on fancy ocean liners, swindling rich passengers out of their money with made-up get-rich-quick schemes. He even had a money-printing machine that he would sell to greedy suckers. It was just a box that slowly pushed out 1 or 2 real $100 bills. Of course, by the time the buyer realized it was just a wooden box with a couple of notes inside, Victor was long gone, probably sipping a cocktail on another continent. This was the level of genius we are dealing with. So when Victor read that newspaper article about the high maintenance and repair costs of the Eiffel Tower, his brain went into overdrive. This was not like selling a silly box. This was the big one. The Sistine Chapel of scams. He went to a printer and had some very fancy, very official-looking government stationery made. He gave himself a fake title, Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. It sounds important, doesn't it? With his fake identity and fancy paper, Victor was ready to set his plan in motion. He drew up a list of the top 5 scrap dealers in the city and sent each of them a very serious-looking letter, inviting them to a confidential meeting at one of Paris's most exclusive hotels. The 5 scrap metal dealers arrived at the luxurious Hotel de Crillon, one by one, feeling very important. They were met by the charming Deputy Director General Victor Lustig in a lavish suite. He was calm, professional, and had an air of authority that was completely convincing. He started by telling them how much the government trusted their discretion. He said the matter he was about to discuss was a state secret. He explained that the government had made a very difficult decision. The Eiffel Tower, he said with a heavy sigh, had to come down. He laid it on thick. He talked about the engineering problems and the astronomical maintenance costs. "Gentlemen," he probably said, looking each of them in the eye, "the upkeep is simply bankrupting the city. Painting it alone is a nightmare." To make his story even more believable, Victor even took the men on a tour of the tower. He hired a limousine and drove them around the landmark, pointing out imaginary structural weaknesses and sighing about the cost of it all. He did not have any special access, of course. He was just a tourist like anyone else, but he acted like he owned the place. During the tour and the meetings, Victor was carefully studying his marks. He quickly identified his man André Poisson. Poisson was a bit newer to the Paris business scene. He felt insecure and was desperate to make a name for himself among the city's elite. At their second meeting, Victor changed his act. He dropped the professional government official routine and became a bit more personal. He sighed and confessed to Poisson that his government salary was terribly low. He complained that it was impossible to live the kind of life he wanted on a minister's pay. He was not asking for a bribe directly. Oh no, he was far too smooth for that. He was just hinting very strongly that a little extra something would help ensure that Poisson's bid was the one that was chosen. It was a genius move. For Poisson, this suddenly made everything clear. Ah, a corrupt government official. Now that made sense. Feeling relieved and clever for having figured it out, Poisson not only handed over the check for the Eiffel Tower scrap, but he also added a very large cash bribe on top, just to grease the wheels. Victor Lustig accepted both with a solemn nod, trying very hard not to laugh. With a suitcase full of cash, Victor Lustig did not stick around to see the look on Poisson's face. He and his American secretary, a man named Dan Collins, were on the first train out of Paris. They headed straight for Vienna, where they checked into a fancy hotel and lived like kings. They probably ordered the most expensive things on the menu and laughed themselves silly thinking about poor André Poisson. Can you imagine the conversation? Did you see his face when he gave me the bribe? He actually thought he was buying the Eiffel Tower. Back in Paris, André Poisson waited and waited. He had the contract, he had paid the money, but he heard nothing from the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. Days turned into a week. He started to get a bit nervous. He tried calling the ministry, but of course no one there had ever heard of a Deputy Director General Lustig. The truth slowly began to dawn on him like a horrible cold sunrise. He had not bought the Eiffel Tower. He had been conned, he had lost a fortune, and even worse, he had been made to look like a complete and utter fool. Now here is the funny part. What would you do if you were Poisson? You would go to the police, right? But Poisson did nothing. He said not a single word. Why? Because he was too embarrassed. How could he, a savvy businessman, admit to the world that he had tried to buy the Eiffel Tower from a man he met in a hotel? This silence was exactly what Victor had counted on. He knew that the shame of the victim is a con artist's best friend. After a few months of living the high life in Vienna, Victor Lustig got bored. The money was great, but the thrill was gone. And he noticed something interesting. Despite his constant scanning of the international press, there was absolutely no mention of his incredible Eiffel Tower con. A wicked, brilliant, and incredibly bold idea began to form in his mind. If it worked so well the first time, why not do it again? So, in an act of unbelievable nerve, Victor Lustig returned to Paris just a month later. He checked back into a fancy hotel, got his fake government stationery out again, and prepared to sell the Eiffel Tower for a second time. He invited this new group of 5 dealers for a meeting. He was just as charming, just as convincing as he was the first time. He had the whole performance down to a fine art. The dealers listened intently, their minds whirling with the possibilities. It was working. Again. He was actually going to pull it off a second time. This time, however, he had a little bit of bad luck. One of the dealers in this new group was a bit sharper than the last lot. Before handing over any money, this dealer decided to check with the authorities. He made a quiet phone call to the police to ask about this secret government project. The police, of course, had no idea what he was talking about, but were very interested to hear more. They realized a scam was in progress. But before they could get to the hotel to catch him, someone must have tipped Victor off. He smelled trouble, grabbed his suitcase, and fled the city just in time. But this time without any money.
Thank you for watching. Hope you found this video informative and entertaining. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment. We do like to know and hear your feedback. And if you have the means, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get early access to our videos, and where we post bonus material. Till next time, this is Geeky Tidbits saying cheers and have a good day.